It's a global pandemic. The end of the world. Who are you dreaming of? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome, and welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Today, I am very excited to give a review of the new anthology collection called The End of the World as We Know It, New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand. And this was just released in August, the end of August of 2025. It's edited by Golden and Brian Keene, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is 32 amazing short stories that are all set in the world of The Stand, of Stephen King's The Stand. And Stephen King wrote the introduction to the book. He signed off on all the stories, and it's incredible. I didn't receive a review copy of this. In fact, I purchased multiple copies. I wanted the hardcover version of this, and the hardcover version is over 800 pages long. It's 32 stories. And, Brian Keene and Christopher Golden have said that if they're going to make a companion piece to The Stand, then it should be just as girthy as The Stand. So it is an 800-page behemoth of amazing stories, and I wanted that copy. Here in India, if I were to purchase a physical copy, I would be getting a paperback. A lot of the books that are still only available in hardcover in Europe and in America, you get a copy in India, and you see in small letters in the back, this is for purchase on the Indian subcontinent only, and I didn't want the paperback. So I purchased a digital copy so I could read a copy right away, and I have a hardcover waiting for me back in America. This is great. This is a really wonderful collection of stories. And then Brian Keene and Christopher Golden contacted a bunch of their favorite authors, mostly horror authors, though some outside of horror as well. And they asked them to write stories about the world of The Stand. And they gave them very few parameters. You can't use any of the main characters from The Stand, but you can interact with them. And they gave them three kind of sections or three groupings, let's say. And I'll get into that in a minute. And they just let them go at it. And the result, is amazing. When I heard about this announced, a couple months ago, I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. But then in recent months, as Brian Keene and Christopher Golden have been doing like the rounds, and I've heard them on different podcasts and whatnot, kind of promoting the release of this book, I was just gotten more and more excited. So I started reading it, I think, the day after it was released. And at first, I was just going to read a story a day, especially because I've been busy and, it's been a busy time in my life right now. So my plan was to read a story a day and take a month to enjoy it slowly. And that didn't happen. I read it in less than a week. I think I just devoured it. You don't have to know the story of The Stand to enjoy this collection, but it definitely helps. The Stand is possibly, arguably, Stephen King's magnum opus. Some people would say The Dark Tower is his magnum opus. That's a little difficult. The Dark Tower, like the main story, is 7 novels long. And then there's an ancillary 8th novel. And then really, if you want to be in the world of The Dark Tower, The Stand, especially the antagonist of The Stand, plays a critical part, as well as Salem's Lot you have to read. You don't have to, but it's kind of important. Insomnia maybe is also important. So it's hard to call that a magnum opus when it is, 10 or 11 distinct novels. Whereas The Stand is, for a single novel, a big beast of a novel, it is by many considered to be his magnum opus. And I was just listening to a podcast the other day where someone was arguing that is one of the best pieces of 20th century literature, full stop. He said, hold it up to Tolstoy, hold it up to Hemingway, hold it up to any other great. And now, not everyone may agree, but in 50 years, 100 years, they're going to look at The Stand, and they're going to look at Stephen King's style of prose, which is directly addressing the working man, and is written in a way that gets rid of all ivory towers and is accessible to an audience to reach into their heart and to make character emotions important. And I don't know if I agree with that, but I do think it is a phenomenal book. And a lot of people complain that King is not good at endings. And whether you're new to Stephen King or you're a longtime constant reader, that is kind of a thing. Stephen King isn't great at endings. And you know what? I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I don't really agree, especially having done more rereading of Stephen King. Stephen King is focused on character, and he's focused on the character's journey. And he's going to let the story go wherever it needs to go for that character's journey to be complete and whole and follow its logical conclusion. That may not be the most satisfying place for the narrative to go, for the plot to go, and he doesn't really care. He does not seem interested in giving you the most satisfying plot or the most satisfying narrative if it is at the expense of the character's inner journey, because that is what he cares about. Is where the character is going to go, where they start, how they transform, where they end up. And that has to make sense for the character. That journey is so much more important than the overall plot of the story. And if you go into Stephen King's work with that in mind, then the endings make more sense because he isn't interested in your narrative framework. He's interested in this character framework. But I digress. I'm going to talk a little bit about The Stand without any spoilers, just to give some context. But you don't really need to read The Stand to enjoy this collection, though it definitely makes the collection a lot more fun. The Stand there's an interesting production history. It was originally released, I think, in 78, right? I think so. And that is now considered the abridged version. It's no longer available. It was re-released in 1990. And the original version was, I think, around 900 pages. And the re-released version is 1,200 pages, a little more than that. And the reason for the abridged version isn't due to editor decisions or anything like that. It simply has to do with the publisher couldn't publish a book that size. There was too many pages. And they said, you can't, like, the way we publish books, it just can't be this big. So King himself is the one that took out the scenes. He's the one that changed it and gave them an abridged version. But the version he wants you to read, which he was able to publish again in 1990, is the 1,200 page version, where he put back in the scenes that he had taken out. He changed some other scenes. He updated it to take place in 1990, and he made a few tweaks here and there, but that is the final version, the version he wants you to read. And that's an interesting, one of the stories plays with that discrepancy. But so it came out in 1990, the final version of it. And the premise really simply is there is an American biomedical lab, and a super virus, a superflu, is leaked, accidentally escapes this lab. And it kills 99.4% of the global population in the span of less than a month. It just rips through everyone. And while people are experiencing this plague, a lot of people start having dreams. And so the story takes place in America. Now, these short stories don't all take place in America, so it's interesting to see what happened overseas. But the story, takes place in America, and it follows a number of different characters, who have survived. They are part of the 0.6% of people who haven't died from the superflu. And they start having dreams. And the dreams are of two varieties. They either dream of the walking dude, of Randall Flagg, of this mysterious, dark, malevolent kind of force who is inviting them to come to Las Vegas, to live your dreams, to live your ideas of power and wealth and everything you can want. Come to Las Vegas, meet me there. That's where we're going to rebuild the world. And the other dream people have is of an old woman, Mother Abigail, you find out her name is. She's 108 years old, you also find out. And she is sitting on the front porch of a small home in the middle of a cornfield in Nebraska. And these are the two dreams. And people have versions of these dreams. And sometimes they have both, right? Or sometimes they'll have a dream of Mother Abigail, but they'll know there is a wolf with red eyes in the corn. So these dreams are leading people to one direction or another. And that is the first section of the book, the section that happens during the plague. Okay. Then the second section is people are then traveling. So they're going to either Nebraska or Las Vegas, essentially. Those are the two locations. And they're going to figure out what these dreams are about. Because when they start realizing that other people are having the same dream, they realize it's some sort of prophetic dream. And people start moving. So the second section of the book has to do with this movement of travel, of going to these destinations, of getting wherever it is your dream said you have to go. And then the third section is them actually making establishments there. The establishment in Nebraska quickly moves to Colorado, to the Boulder free zone. And so you have an establishment in Boulder and an establishment in Las Vegas. Those are the two epicenters, you could say, for our story. And Mother Abigail and her group is in Boulder, and Randall Flagg, the walking dude, is in Las Vegas. And then there's an eventual stand between good and evil, right? A showdown of some sort, let's say. You could think this story is about, good versus evil in a very kind of grand sense. And I guess you wouldn't be wrong, but you wouldn't be right either. Because the way the story of The Stand is about good versus evil is not on a cosmic level. It's on an existential level. It's on a personal level. It is on you. What do you choose, right? Who do you follow? And King shows that often choosing the side of good is hard, right? When you have the option to help or to harm, it's often more difficult to help. You often have to sacrifice something of yourself if you want to be a good person. But what do you choose? Who do you follow? Do you follow the light or the dark, right? So the question and these journeys of all these different characters as they go from one place to another and as they meet up with other survivors and as they make these decisions, it isn't about the end of the world. It's about them as individuals. It's about you. Who do you follow, right? What are you willing to sacrifice to be a good person? What difficulties are you willing to shoulder or to bear in order to stand up for what is right? That is the question that all of these people are asked in the world of The Stand. And that is the world that these short stories are thrown into. And they are divided into 3 sections. So the first section is called Down with the Sickness. And these are all stories that happened during the plague. Then the second section is called The Long Walk. And these are sections that have to do with traveling, that have to do with people moving to one place or another, ostensibly to Nebraska or Las Vegas. And then the third section is called Life Was Such a Wheel. And this all takes place after the events of The Stand, and this is the shortest section. There's only 6 stories in this section. And some of them are, hundreds of years after, and some are, within living memory of the events. But these all take place in the world after The Stand. So what I'll say is, I was really excited for these stories, and they didn't let me down. I think there's one or two stories that are just kind of meh for me, and everything else is great. Usually, when I am reviewing a short story collection, I don't go through individual stories because that would take too long, especially with 32 stories. But I'm going to call out a few that I think were really special and that jumped out to me. And I'm going to just list some of the authors as I go, even if I don't talk about their story. But one thing, overall, my overall impression, and I guess it surprised me, is that most of the stories have an optimistic point of view. Maybe not about the world and about the people in the world, but at least the person you're following is a person who's trying to do the right thing, generally. Not for all the stories, but for most of them. And I was surprised, in part because part of the beauty of The Stand is you follow so many different characters in different perspectives that some of the characters you follow are going to Las Vegas, right? They are following the walking dude. They're not good people, or they have the chance to be good people and they choose not to be. And that's fun. Like, their stories are a lot of fun, and the way they fit into the plot is a lot of fun. And I expected a lot of the contemporary horror authors to go in that direction, right? To dig into the juiciness of like being a bad person and like where you can like twist that knife. And they don't do that. At least most of them don't. They go for the optimistic point of view where the person they're following is trying to figure out how to be a good person. And then their antagonists in the stories are people that are, on their way to Las Vegas, let's say, which I thought was interesting. It was kind of unexpected. It makes sense, I guess, in the short story format. It's harder to give as many perspectives. When you have a book that's over 1,200 pages long, then you can have some characters that are despicable that you spend decent amounts of time with because they're counterbalanced by other characters, right? And so they're adding, more colors to your palette in that way. When it's a short story and you're only following one character, maybe you don't want to spend all that much time with those kind of despicable characters. So it makes sense if you think about it, but I hadn't thought about it, I guess, before starting the collection. So I was surprised about how optimistic this collection is overall. There are still some very grim stories. It's about the end of the world, okay? There are some grim stories. There are some dark stories in the collection, but overall, it gave me much more optimistic vibes than I kind of had anticipated. So starting with the opening section, Down with the Sickness, In the Plague, so many phenomenal authors. Stories, they start out with some really dark stories, like to punch you in the gut right in the beginning and say, look, you should know what you're up against. So, it opens up with a story called Room 24 by Carolyn Kepnes. And then that's followed immediately by The Trips by Wrath James White, which takes place in the hood. Like, what would happen in the hood? And those both, are like a 1-2 punch. The superflu is called Captain Trips. That's the nickname for it. And so that's where the Trips comes from. But the next story I want to call out is the third story, Bright Light City by Meg Gardner. This takes place in Las Vegas, which I think is genius. And the main character is a woman who has dreams of Nebraska, essentially. But she realizes that all of these bad things are coming to Las Vegas. She is at the epicenter of where all the people she doesn't want to be around are going to come. And she happens to be a flight attendant, and her flight gets canceled. Obviously, she isn't able to travel. And there's a young girl on her flight who is alone now. And so she feels protective of this young girl, and she wants to get this young girl out of Las Vegas. But there are already people in Las Vegas who don't want anyone to leave. They want to make offerings to the walking dude for when he arrives. And so she has to escape from Las Vegas. That's her goal. And I thought it was an incredible idea. I hadn't even thought of it, and it was a lot of fun. So starting out right away, Bright Light City is a great story. Every Dog Has His Day, a great story about searching for your pup. With Captain Trips, it affects animals selectively. Right? So we find out in The Stand that domesticated dogs, for the most part, are affected at the same rate as humans. So 99.4% of domesticated dogs all die as well. So there are a number of dead dogs in this collection, as a forewarning. Domesticated horses also die at the same rate, give or take 99%, more than 99%. Other animals like cats and birds and mice and rats don't seem to be affected. And you don't really know why. There's some supposition in the book. One character supposes it might be because we have domesticated dogs and horses to such an extent that somehow that domestication has made them susceptible, but you're not really given an answer. So some animals do succumb to the superflu, to Captain Trips, at more or less the same rate as humans, and some don't. But so Every Dog Has His Day by Brian Smith is a story searching for his pup who has escaped. Lockdown by Bev Vincent. Bev Vincent is a longtime collaborator of Stephen King's, and Lockdown takes place on a small island off the coast of Maine, I believe, and I think there's like 15 people in this island because the summer rush hasn't started yet when the plague happens, and They don't know if they're immune or not from the plague, but they decide they're just going to lock down. They're 2 miles off the coast. They're far enough that they're just not going to let anyone on their island. They have enough food and supplies. They just had a supply run very recently. There's no longer regular ferry service because their island is so remote and it's no longer as popular as it used to be. So they're just going to stay on their own. And they are fighting with the sense of what to do now. If we are cutting ourselves off from the world, how long can we survive? What do we do if someone tries to come? What if one of us wants to leave? And what does that say about us as individuals? So that is a great premise, right? Like, what happens with the superflu if you have the ability to be trapped on this small island? Is it really trapped or is it salvation? That's a great story. There's a great story by Joe R. Lansdale that is very gritty. It's very much very typical Lansdale of someone being chased by some nefarious actors. What else? There's a wonderful story by Jonathan Jans, if you know him. Gabino Iglesias, also a great story. Another story I want to call out that was really fun is The Wrong Fucking Place at the Wrong Fucking Time by C. Robert Cargill. This is a really sweet story. It takes place in middle of nowhere, Texas, a small town. The two main characters are two ranchers, or they work at a ranch. They're just ranch hands, right? They're kind of nobodies, and they both happen to survive, and almost everyone else in their small town dies. And they say, well, this ranch has everything we need, so we can just keep taking care of the animals, right? Why should we let these animals suffer? And they go around town every day, and they see if anyone is sick or if anyone's dying, and they kind of collect all the corpses, and they make some sort of mass grave, but they just go about their business. And they love movies, and they're two roommates that live together. So every day after they finish work at the ranch, they go to the movie rental store and they grab a couple DVDs. And as long as the generators are still running, they can still have cold beer and they watch some movies together. And now there's another person they find, another survivor in their town who is an ornery kind of old man, and he greets them with a shotgun. And they're just like, hey, you know what? Cool. You do you. We'll do us. If you ever want company, you know where we are. And there's this like burgeoning relationship between this kind of, surly old man and these two young ranch hands. And it's really sweet. And then one day some strangers show up in their middle of nowhere town and they want to be friendly to the strangers, but the strangers don't have, let's say, good intentions. And so it goes from there. Really, really great story. Really hard hitting, really pleasant characters to spend time with that you care about, like, deeply. Then there's a story by Haley Piper, which is also really great. It looks at someone, it's called Prey Instinct, a character who always feels like she is victimized. Not always feels like she is victimized, right? So when your whole mentality becomes one of being a victim, then what do you do to protect yourself, right? Like, how do you lash out? How dangerous do you become in an effort to always protect yourself? And what does that do to your heart if your whole existence is one of lashing out of fear, right? It's a great story. A story by Tim Levin called Grace that takes place on a space shuttle. Not a space station, but a space shuttle, a group of people who were intending to return to Earth, to America. And all of a sudden, things have, gone backwards. So that's an interesting story as well. And then the last 4 stories of this section, I jumped over a few. The last 4 stories are all incredible. They're all like, 5-star God tier stories. First one by Catriona Ward. It's called The African Painted Dog. And this is from the point of view of a pair of African painted dogs at a zoo who eventually try to escape the zoo. And the whole story is their experience from the point of view of these African painted dogs. And it is wonderful. It is so good. It's so well done. To do stories from the point of views of animals don't always work, but it works really well here. Then there's a story by Poppy Z. Bright, still writing as Poppy Z. Bright. He decides to write as Poppy Z. Bright, and that's called Till Human Voices Wake Us and We Drown. And this story is the most surreal story in the whole collection. It broke my head a little bit. I need to go read it again. It's incredible. It's really dark. It doesn't feel like it's really dark until it becomes really dark, and you realize that it is. It takes place in like a beachside resort kind of town. Yeah, I won't give too much away about it, but it is about a young boy who survives, a young boy, like a teenager. I'd say maybe, I think 17 or 18, and then an old man who survives. And the old man is caring what he is caring for, like the livestock he has at his house that he's caring for, and how that is handed off to this young boy. It is wild. It's really incredible. And then Kovac's Last Case by Michael Kortia. So I don't remember where in the US this takes place, but the premise is there's a detective, and he finds out that now, even after the plague hits, there's a serial killer. And he decides he needs to stop the serial killer. He finds evidence that there is someone who is engaging in these ritual killings of all these people. And so that's his last case, that he has to stop this serial killer. So it's very much a crime story that is set in the middle of this plague, right? Then the last story, Make Your Own Way by Alma Katsu, is incredible. I think Amakatsu actually hadn't read The Stand before they reached out to her and they asked her to write the story, and she agreed. And so she read The Stand and decided where she thought she could fit in. And her story takes place on a small, remote farm. I don't remember where it is, Montana, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but it's very remote, and everyone dies except for the teenage girl. And she's like, you know what? I live my life on a farm. I can take care of a farm. And so she's doing her business, trying to go through the motions of taking care of this farm by herself. Then a boy comes, a boy from the city, and he was from the local university, and he's been walking for days, and he doesn't know anything about farming, but he needs help. And so the two of them kind of create a relationship together. And where does it go from there? From this younger girl who is kind of somewhat inexperienced in the world, but knows what it means to live on a farm and her whole family has died and all of her neighbors are dead. Everyone she knows has died. So there's obviously severe trauma, but she isn't as affected by the plague as other people, since she is somewhat self-sufficient on this farm, versus this city boy who's a couple years older than her. He's more worldly, but what does he really bring to the table, right? What does he want from her? So that is a really, really wonderful way to end the first section. So those are just a few of the stories. There's still a half dozen stories or more that I didn't mention. Then we get to the second part, and I won't talk about many of these stories, but I will mention some names. So the second part is called The Long Walk. It starts with I Love the Dead by Josh Mallerman. And this story is actually kind of funny. It is a Grateful Dead fan, right? And so Captain Trips is a nickname for Jerry Garcia. And we don't know why in The Stand. I don't think it's ever mentioned why it is given that nickname, but it is. And so this character is so upset that it's been given the nickname of Captain Trips that he has decided he's going to San Francisco to meet Jerry Garcia, because there's no way some superflu could take out the greatest musician in the world. And so his journey is one to San Francisco. Everyone else is going either to Las Vegas or to Nebraska. And he says, screw the woman on the porch, screw the walking man, I'm going to San Francisco. And so it's his kind of own journey. And it's quite funny. It's actually quite good. There's a story by Cynthia Pelayo called Milagros. This takes place in Puerto Rico, and this is gutting, this story. Whew. I had to put the book down a little bit after this one. It went somewhere I did not expect it to go, and it was really, really strong for it, about a young girl who is making her way to the beach because she believes that there's some sort of salvation there. So from her home, she has to make her way. And I won't give too much away, but it's a lot. It's heavy. It's really, really good. There's a great story by S.A. Cosby that comes up next. So again, not a horror author traditionally, but a crime author. He does his part. And there's a story by V. Castro that takes place in England. There's a story by Usman Timalik, who is a Pakistani-American author, and that takes place in Pakistan. It's called The Mosque at the End of the World. That is really great, actually. Really fun. There's a story by Tananariva Due and Stephen Barnes being her husband, and it's called The Boatman. It takes place in the Florida Keys, I believe. Also a really kind of dark but uplifting story at the same time, if that makes sense. I really enjoyed it. A story by Paul Tremblay, which is called The Story I Tell is a Story of Some of Us. And that is kind of written in the first person on occasion. It's very interesting. It's like directly addressing the reader. Now I will say the last story in this section is the one story that follows a main character from The Stand. And they had to get special permission to write this story. And I had high hopes for it, and it's the one story that kind of let me down a little bit. Not because it's a bad story, but because it just seems too easy. And the story is called Abigail's Gethsemane, and it is by Wayne Brady, the comedian and the actor, and Morris Broadus. They wrote it together. And, so Mother Abigail is this kind of prophet-like figure, right? Who everyone is dreaming about in Nebraska. She's 108 years old at the time of the superflu. So she lived through the pandemic of 1918. And this story goes back and forth in time. It starts place in 1919, right after the pandemic that she survived. And at one point, either in Nebraska or in Boulder, I don't remember which, at one point she leaves, right? She just leaves a note and says, I have to go, spend my time in the desert, essentially. And so she goes away. And everyone in town has to figure out, what do we do? Should we go after her? What do we do in her absence? It's a whole plot point. But we don't really know where she went or what she was doing in that time. And this story fills that in, what she was doing when she left the encampment. Why did she leave? And what was she doing, right? What kind of prayer or meditation was she engaging in? And what kind of, devils did she meet in her metaphorical desert, let's say? And so this story goes back and forth between the time of The Stand, where she is on whatever this pilgrimage that she's going on, and 1919 when she was a young girl. And that I think is great. I think that the premise of looking at those 2 points in time of her life are really interesting. The reason it didn't do a lot for me is because it took the lowest hanging fruit for what you could think of happening in those stories, and that's what it did. At least to me. Like if you were to say, think of what this character would be doing in 1919, think of what she was doing when she went away from the camp. The first two thoughts that would come to my head are what they wrote about. And I think anyone that has read The Stand would have a similar experience. And I just kind of had hoped that it would be a little more complicated, right? A little deeper, a little messier, maybe. But it wasn't a bad story. I still enjoyed it. I just didn't enjoy it as much as I'd hoped to. So it's the one story they had to get special permission for writing because it is actually following a specific character. But that's the end of the second section. And then we get to the third section, which is called Life Was Such a Wheel. And these 6 stories all take place after the events of The Stand. And these are all great. Like these are all incredible stories, all 6 of them. They are, they knock it out of the park, every one. First one is by Ronald Melfi, and I've had mixed experiences with Ronald Melfi. This is great. This is a story about a community who, you find out there's a man who wrote the story of The Stand right before it happened, basically. So right before this pandemic happened, he had written a fictional novel that is about a superflu and about people having prophetic dreams. And it came out like just before the superflu actually erupted. And so he survived the superflu and he survived the events of Boulder and Las Vegas, and now people think of him as a prophet. And so what small communities have formed up that still exist now in America, he travels among them, and they greet him like a prophet. You are in this one community where they are preparing for his arrival, and you follow this young woman who's been put in charge of housing him overnight and giving him dinner and like being, his liaison when he gets to their small community. But her husband wants nothing to do with it. Like her husband is just like shutting it down, and he is just like very angry, gruff kind of guy who wants nothing to do with it. And there is obviously interaction when he goes up to give his, he gives a performance. He doesn't offer any new prophecies because he hasn't had any new prophecies. He never thought of himself as a prophet, but he's going around doing this circuit. People want to be in his presence because they think he might have something to share. And it doesn't go where I expected it to. And it's great. Really good story. Awaiting Orders in Flagston by Somer Cannon. This is a gnarly story. This takes place in a community, calling it Flagston will set you off. Randall Flagg is the antagonist, right? So Flagston, who this community, they're exiles from Las Vegas, let's say, or they never made it to Las Vegas. I'm not quite sure. But they are waiting for a new prophet, right? They're waiting for the whole cycle to start again. And there's one young girl in their community who never had any dreams. She didn't dream of the old woman or the walking dude. And so they've decided that she must be the new prophet and that her dreams are going to tell them what to do next. And they lock her in a shed in the middle of the woods and torture her until she has dreams for them. And that's the premise of it. It's really, really dark, but really, it's gruesome at some points. Really smart story. Oh my goodness, so good. And then a story by Chuck Wendig called Grand Junction about a young community, a young man who is a really good hunter, and he gets called up by his community leader because they think that that evil is coming back into the world and they have to go hunt it down. And he goes on this hunting party with them, but not everything is as it seems, as is the case with many short stories in the horror genre. Really good story. Story by Premi Muhammad, takes place in Canada. In many of these stories, especially the ones that follow after the events of The Stand, they're looking at babies and what is the situation with new babies. And they don't all have the same opinion of it. But let's say it's not good. It's not a good situation. When there's a superflu that kills off 99.4% of people, there's no guarantee that your child is going to have immunity to that. And that flu still exists. It just so happens that this small group of people have immunity. But it doesn't mean the flu or the virus doesn't exist. And so children are often like a point of contention in all of these stories because maybe the human race just won't survive. Even this 1% or less than 1% survived. But if they're not able to have new children because they have children and the children die right away from Captain Trips, then what is left for the future, right? So many of them have this bleak outlook. Not all of them, but many of them do. And so this is a story where it seems that there aren't any children. And it's been many years since the flu. And all of a sudden, there is a child. There's a young girl that shows up in the middle of the woods in nowhere in the middle of Canada. And so that's the story. It's called Hunted to Extinction. Really good. And then the last 2 stories are in this section are probably my favorite stories in the book. They're not the last 2 stories in the whole book because there is another section that I'll mention that at the end. But the last 2 stories in this section, the first one is called Came the Last Night of Sadness by Catherine M. Valente. This story brought me to tears. I won't want to give too much away, but this young woman who is this many, many, many years after the events of The Stand. And there's this young woman who basically is a loner. She's a nomad going from place to place. And she might visit a community for a while, but she generally drifts away from those communities. And what she looks for And what she seeks out when she finds old homes is not for food and not for clothing, but she looks for stories. She looks for the stories that people wrote down in their last moments of dying from this disease, the part of themselves they felt they had to commit to paper to share with others. That's what she collects. And so she's got a whole collection of loose leaf papers of people writing their stories. And that is how she gets to know people, is through their stories. She believes it's her job to collect these stories, to be the recipient of these stories. So she's traveling around trying to collect them. And the story goes back and forth between her perspective as she finds a new story, and then from the perspective of that story. So you get this dueling points of view. And at some point, you see her history of her traveling around, and it seems like wherever she travels, bad luck follows her, which is part of the reason that she finds she has to be a loner, because wherever she goes, things seem to go wrong. But when she's with stories and with people that have already died, then that is powerful to her. And interspersed with this, you end up having the story, and I don't even remember how you get to it, but there ends up being the story of these elephants. And from the elephant's point of view, a mother elephant and her child. And either they had escaped from a zoo, or they are descendants of elephants that had escaped from a zoo at the time of the pandemic. I think they're descendants of elephants that had escaped from a zoo during the pandemic. And you have their story as they go through the world parallel to this young woman. And it's just heartbreaking. It's so beautiful. And yeah, I can't give it words because I'd give away too much of the beauty of the story. But when you learn all of the pieces and you really learn, like I said, like what the stand is about, right? It's not about cosmic good versus cosmic evil. It's not about gods and monsters. It's about you as an individual and the choices you make. This story contains all of that, right? It's phenomenal. Really, really good. And then the last story in this section is called The Devil's Children by Sarah Langan. Also great. Imagine a small community of people who were never immune to the plague, but they survived anyway because they were already on the fringes of society. And now society has rebuilt itself, but they still exist. And so they are like a protected class. And so supposedly they have like reservations that they're allowed to live on because everyone knows they don't have any immunity. And the rest of the world is being rebuilt around them, but the rest of the world wants what they have. It wants their land, it wants their resources, it wants all these things. And wants to use them as guinea pigs to test out vaccines for new versions of the superflu in case it were to happen. And so they supposedly have been granted sanctuary and reservation land, but that is always called into question, right? And so they are the devil's children. That another great story, a really strong way to end this section of the collection. And then the last section only has 2 stories, and they added this last section because these stories don't go anywhere else, and they don't make any sense in the timeline of the stand. The one of them is by Nat Cassidy. Now, Nat Cassidy is a Stephen King superfan, and this really belongs in The Dark Tower more than it belongs in The Stand, and it's called The Unfortunate Convalescence of the Super Lawyer. And the whole premise of this story is, in the original version, the abridged version of The Stand, there's some characters that find an abandoned car, and in the abandoned car, the keys are still in the car, and there's a key ring, and it has 2 initials on it. I don't remember actually what the initials are right now. Maybe SC, I think. But it has a pair of initials, okay? And that's it. And then they just, I wonder who this car belonged to, whatever. No big deal. They move on. In the unabridged version, the same characters come across that same car, but for some reason, King changed the initials of the on the keychain. The keychain has a different set of initials, and King has a reason for it, but it doesn't matter. It's not important to the story. It doesn't matter for anything. But Nat Cassidy noticed it, and his whole story is based on why those initials are different and who belonged to the initial set of initials, to the original set, and what happened to him, and why there are new initials on the final set. So it's this meta story. So like I said, in many ways, it belongs in The Dark Tower. That's what it feels like it's a part of, more than The Stand. But it's great. It's not scary in any way. Well, maybe it's a little scary. There's little pieces of Eyes of the Dragon get mixed in here. Some other stories get mixed in. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's a very meta story. It's quite funny. It is like looking behind the curtain at the way the wheel turns in a way that only Nat Cassidy can do. So that is a lot of fun. And then the last story in the collection is called Walk on Gilded Splinters by David Show. And this takes place thousands of years after the event of The Stand. And this is a story about storytelling and about the sacrifices we make to preserve stories and the power of story. And again, a really contemplative kind of short story. There is some action in the middle of it, but it is really thoughtful and a really fitting way to end the story. To end the collection, rather. And then, of course, there's an afterword by Brian Keene. Now, neither Brian Keene nor Christopher Golden included their own stories in the collection. They said, as the editors of the anthology, we thought it would be improper. And in his introduction, Stephen King says the only thing that he thinks Christopher Golden and Brian Keene did wrong was not include stories of their own, which is kind of like, a gut punch, I imagine, as the editor to read that when Stephen King writes that introduction. But they chose not to include their own stories. Brian Keene talks about how he's read this book, The Stand, every year since he first read it as a child. So he's read it over 40 times, which is mind-blowing to me. He is in a severe accident a couple of years ago, and in the hospital, his wife brought him a pad of paper, a pen, and a copy of The Stand. Like, that's all she brought for him to rehabilitate after this like really bad burn he had, and he was a life-threatening accident he was in. So his love for The Stand, as well as Christopher Golden's love for The Stand, comes through in the introduction. The introduction is written by Stephen King. There's a foreword written by Christopher Golden and an afterword written by Brian Keene. Their love for The Stand comes through in those small bits, but also just the way they've curated this collection. It is so much fun. It is really a collection that I hope to be returning to again and again. I had fun with the whole thing. I don't have a lot more to say. This is going on way too long, this review, especially for a short story collection, but I had a lot to say about these stories. There are 32 stories in this collection. It's a big chunker of a collection, and it lines up on the shelf right next to The Stand, and it makes sense. I think this is a great collection. This is probably, I don't know if it's my favorite book I've read this year, but it's up there. And it's rare for a short story collection to be my list of favorites for the year, but this one really is. It's great. It's really great. Whether you love Stephen King or not, whether you have read The Stand or not, I think this collection, especially if you just know the outline of The Stand and you know what the stakes are of that original novel, there's something in this collection for everyone. And I had a really great time with it. I'd love to hear, have any of you read this yet? What are your favorite stories? I'd love to talk about some of these stories with people. So I'd love to hear all your thoughts and your ideas down below in the comments. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves. Take care of each other and go slowly.